Derby Line is a village of 700 people within the town of Derby, located in the rural Northeast Kingdom section of Vermont. Stansted is a town of about 3,000 residents. Like many rural border communities in the U.S. and Canada, their economies and cultures are linked, but the ties have become strained under President Trump, who has advanced tariffs and tightened border protections in some communities that rely upon one another. Why do this? Why do this? Like President Trump, I think it's right to say America first. But I don't want America alone. I don't want an America pushing aside its long-standing allies who have stood with us. Canada stood with us at 9/11. Canada has stood side by side with U.S. troops in every war we have been in. They have fought with our troops. They've bled with our troops. They've died with our troops in every war since the War of 1812. And yet we're going to treat them like an enemy. And we're going to make them come through an emergency exit into a library. This calls up to mind memories that I have of a South when I was born, where certain kind of people couldn't go in the same door as other kind of people. This is no way to treat an ally. This is no way to treat a friend. Mr. President, as I conclude, I see other colleagues here ready to speak. I'm happy to say that the Senate Joint Resolution 37 has picked up the support of a whole lot of people that I think are pretty important people outside this chamber. This morning, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce weighed in support of SJ Res 37. I'm going to read from the letter that they have sent to senators. The tariffs being imposed on imports from Canada and Mexico, America's top two trading partners, are inflicting real harm on American workers, companies, and farmers. Tariffs are taxes paid by Americans, and they will quickly increase prices at a time when many are struggling with the cost of living. These import taxes are also harming U.S. manufacturers and drawing retaliatory duties, worsening their impact on the economy. Further, these tariffs are at odds with the commitments the United States made in the landmark USMCA, which was negotiated by the first Trump administration. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce supports Senate Joint Resolution 37, and they join a number of other organizations. The AFL-CIO, that's threading a needle, Mr. President, when I get the AFL-CIO and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on the same page on a matter of such importance. The United Steelworkers, the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers, the National Retail Federation. Retailers don't want to see costs of products increase. The North American Building Trades Union, sheet metal workers, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Foreign Policy for America, the National Taxpayers Union, tariffs are a tax, and Advancing American Freedom, the think tank that was established by former Vice President Michael Pence, all have weighed in to support SJ Res 37. Tariffs are a tax. Tariffs will hurt our families. Canada is not an enemy. Let's act together to fight fentanyl. We can do that. We have done that. We showed it with the Halt Fentanyl bill we passed 2 weeks ago. But let's not label an ally as an enemy. Let's not impose punishing costs on American families at a time they can't afford it. Let's not hurt American small businesses. Let's not make our national security investments in ships and subs more expensive. I earnestly request that colleagues support SJ 37 when we vote on it later today. And Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington. Oregon. Excuse me, sir.
Northwest.
Northwest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President. I rise to support my colleague Senator Kane's joint resolution to terminate the Trump order placing blanket tariffs on products Americans buy from Canada. And I'm going to start by saying, as a ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, I'm always struck by how much double talk there is about trade. So let's be clear as we start this part of the discussion. Tariffs are taxes on things we buy from other countries. The bottom line is those taxes make it more expensive for Americans to buy those products. No other country pays the tariffs. Let me repeat that. No other country pays the tariffs. The consumer pays the tariff. So if somebody tells you they can do tariffs and do it without raising prices, I'm sorry, but anybody who says that with a straight face is basically taking advantage of you. Every credible economist, every automaker, every business on the record has said that Trump's trade taxes are going to make things more expensive for Americans. Ronald Reagan's favorite economist, Art Laffer, just released a study showing auto tariffs are going to raise car prices by $4,700. The Yale Budget Lab estimates that the full Trump tariff scheme is going to cost an average family thousands of dollars a year. It's one thing if tariffs are imposed with a good strategy, like decreasing sales in the U.S. by raising prices to punish countries that cheat on trade and changing their behavior so that U.S. workers get a fair shake. I've consistently supported targeted tariffs in the past as a tool to fight back against trade cheating, especially by China. When China was stealing America's trade secrets, subsidizing cheap solar panels and then dumping them here to drive U.S. manufacturers out of business, we were shouting from the rooftops for more tariffs on these Chinese goods. But Canada is not China. Canada is America's closest ally, not a rival. Making everything Americans buy from Canada more expensive for some bogus reason is, in the words of the Wall Street Journal, quote, the dumbest trade war in history. There are 8 million American jobs that depend on trade with Canada. Canada is the biggest export market for 32 states. It provides raw materials that so often farmers need to grow their crops. U.S. farmers can't replace 90% of that material that comes from Canada. Definitely not overnight. The only choice is higher prices. Again, Mr. President, higher prices paid for by Americans. So the stuff we buy from Canada gets more expensive. And on top of that, in response, Canada's already slapped tariffs on a whole host of crops. Ag products, dairy, alcohol, manufactured goods, the list goes on and on. Canadian grocery stores pull U.S. products off the shelves. Our small businesses and farmers are losing sales as we speak because of the weird obsession in the Trump administration with attacking our northern neighbor. Mr. President, plunging our economy into recession because of the Trump desire to annex Canada is just bizarre. Bizarre even by Washington, D.C. standards. Congress has delegated far too much of its authority to the executive branch, and it's far past time for the Congress to take it back. In 1962 and 1974, Congress passed laws handing the President major portions of our constitutional power over tariffs. It is time to reverse that trend. Those dates I mentioned, Mr. President, were before my time, but I want everybody to know on our watch, I think this has got to be a bipartisan concern, and we got to take these powers back, because if Republicans say it's not their fault that Trump's destroying our economy, why not do something like this to restore the power of Congress to set tariffs? I'm going to close by addressing the bogus claim of the Trump administration that tariffs are actually intended to stop fentanyl trafficking from Canada. Let me be clear, our immigration system needs reform, and the fentanyl crisis is a serious issue. Oregon is no stranger to the devastating effects it's wreaked on our communities. But reality is there is no crisis at the northern border. Less than 0.1% of fentanyl entering the United States comes from Canada. Fentanyl seizures at the northern border are down over 97% from July 2024. I think almost everybody understands that Canada is not the issue here. So instead of coming up with real solutions to get fentanyl off the street and out of our communities, Donald Trump has decided he would rather make threats and tear off our closest allies. So now, Mr. President, my colleague from Alabama is on the floor, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. We just talked about how we're going to handle it. But I want to be clear. If Donald Trump and the Republicans wanted to address fentanyl in an effective way, they would pass my bill to limit the millions of low-value packages that come into the United States from China and elsewhere. Getting a handle on these so-called de minimis imports will help our border agents detect the illicit imports of things like fentanyl and pill presses before they reach communities in the United States. So with that, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Finance be discharged from further consideration of S1185 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. The bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
Reserving the right to object. The media, for some reason, is in full meltdown mode after President Trump declared today Liberation Day. Only my Democratic colleagues and the media, globalist media, would find a reason to be mad about that. I'm sadly convinced that my colleagues and the woke media would rather President Trump fail than achieve a goal to help the United States of America and the taxpayers. President Trump's views on tariffs, they aren't complicated. He believes, as I do, that America has been ripped off by unfair trade deals for decades and simply wants a level playing field. We have to change directions. What we're doing is not working. U.S. catfish and shrimp producers have faced some of the worst blows. For example, Vietnam is dumping billions, I repeat, billions of pounds of catfish, and India is dumping billions of pounds of shrimp every year into U.S. markets, flooding the markets, and reducing the price for our quality domestic products. It's devastating. We need to put a reciprocal tariff on these countries to protect our American producers. I get calls every day, whether it's cabinets, whether it's produce, whether it's fish, it makes no difference. Our people are going broke. Now, I recognize that tariff actions may cause reciprocal tariffs from other countries. We need to take that in stride. In this country, we've had a party for 249 years. The United States has put that party on. The party needs to continue, but all the other countries that have been built off the American taxpayers, such as the Middle East, such as Europe, such as China, they need to start bringing gifts to the party because the American taxpayer can't afford it any longer. We're $37 trillion in debt. And the only way to pay that down is to force other people to help us. The American taxpayer can't afford it. As a result, American jobs have been sent overseas because of all the domestic problems that we're having for labor, for things that stand out for our manufacturing. We have to get manufacturing back in this country. The days are over. President Trump is 100% committed, folks, 100%. He's going to do whatever it takes to usher in a golden age for the American economy. And by the way, just the threat of President Trump's tariffs has already led India, Vietnam, and Israel to proactively drop significantly and lower tariffs against the United States before it's really even started. And it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat. We should all be united in wanting economic policies that put American farmers, producers, businesses, and manufacturers first. So, Mr. President, for that reason, I object.
Mr. President,
Objection is heard. Senator from Oregon.
so I listened very carefully to my colleague from Alabama, and I don't believe my colleague used the word fentanyl. And that's what we're concerned about in the Pacific Northwest. We're concerned that this fentanyl has hit our country and our region like a wrecking ball. And so maybe when this all gets sorted out, he'll support my bill to crack down on fentanyl everywhere through reforms of this de minimis kind of area. And I would just say, for purposes of our discussion now, what I understand, and we all await the announcement, I gather, sometime late this afternoon, the Trump administration only is going to address de minimis shipments from China and nowhere else. And we got to make this comprehensive. My colleague serving as president knows what it's like in the West with fentanyl hitting us so hard. If you just do it with China, Chinese companies are going to circumvent the rules and transship through other countries. That's why I felt so strongly about a comprehensive solution to get at this fentanyl, this poison that has hit us so hard. Because if you just go to one country, what you're going to have is something called merchandise laundering, Mr. President. We saw it when we did an investigation in the committee. A Chinese company ships its product through an intermediary in Vietnam or another third country. The intermediary then slaps a made in Vietnam sticker on the Chinese product and falsely labels the product, and they can easily evade the Chinese product restrictions. And with millions of shipments coming in from China, there's no way for Customs and Border Protection to police Chinese products transshipped through third countries. This is not a new gimmick. Chinese companies have been circumventing tariffs all this time with products like steel and solar panels. I've been bird-dogging this issue since I passed the Enforce and Protect Act nearly a year ago. My de minimis bill that I hope will get bipartisan support for would stop the flood of low-value packages from all countries on a global scale. That is the only way to deal with this problem, not create, as my colleague from Alabama would do, a gigantic game of whack-a-mole. So I hope we'll be back on this floor doing something comprehensive to fight the scourge of fentanyl, and I proposed it with legislation. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Democratic Whip.
are we on a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, since taking office 72 days ago, the Trump administration has created chaos in our economy. The President, if you'll remember, campaigned on lowering prices for American families. Unfortunately, his policies and actions have done the opposite. Many families are worse off today than when he was sworn in. In February, egg prices, which has become a political standard bearer, hit a new all-time high in the United States. Just last week, a typical U.S. homeowner's monthly mortgage payment also reached an all-time high. And now, Donald Trump's ill-conceived, foolish trade war with one of our top allies is the latest example of his continued pain for America's wallets. On February 1st, the President announced he was imposing a 10% tariff on energy imports from Canada, as well as 25% tariff on all other goods. Unsurprisingly, Canada answered and announced retaliatory tariffs. And just like that, a trade war with our second largest trading partner and closest ally is underway. So how did the President justify such an unprecedented, counterproductive, and harmful move? He cited the International Economy Emergency Powers Act to declare an emergency at our northern border, stating that fentanyl and undocumented migration constituted a national emergency in our relationship with Canada that justified the use of tariffs. The only problem? The justification just doesn't hold water. This International Economic Emergency Powers Act is intended for use in extraordinary cases related to foreign threats, such as placing sanctions on dictators. Trump's executive order declared a so-called emergency at our Canadian border and tied it to Canada's failure to prevent illicit drugs from being trafficked across the border. But Canada is openly willing to address this shared challenge and has cooperated with the United States. Let me be clear, preventing the trafficking of fentanyl is a bipartisan priority, but the fact remains that less than 1% of fentanyl intercepted at the U.S. border comes from Canada. Less than 1%. And Canada has made it clear long ago they're willing to work with us to reduce that amount. The President's use of IEPA to attempt to justify these tariffs is a shoddy excuse to ram through an unpopular agenda and bully yet another close ally of the United States. The President is manufacturing a fake emergency as a guise to enact billions of dollars in taxes on American consumers to fund massive tax cuts for his billionaire buddies. That is unacceptable. The consequences of this trade war will be painful and avoidable. Everyday Americans will feel it. If fully enacted, Trump's trade war will cause price hikes on nearly all basic goods. A new mother buying formula for a baby, parents buying groceries, young person saving up for a car, every American's going to feel it. This tariff policy of President Trump is going to be painful for American families. The impact on farmers, workers, consumers, and businesses across my state of Illinois, sadly, is going to be devastating. Canada is Illinois' largest export market. Illinois exports to Canada totaled $20 billion in 2023. Illinois ranks 5th among 50 U.S. states in exports to Canada, 1st in imports. And states across the nation are going to feel a similar impact. So it's no surprise the vast majority of Americans cannot understand what the President is trying to do when it comes to our relationship with a good friend, trusted ally, and historic partner, Canada. But President Trump recently said he couldn't care less. If car makers hike prices in response to tariffs, couldn't care less. Pushing forward with this plan that economists, experts, and even the White House itself admits is going to be painful for American families. The last election was all about the cost of living. This is going to raise the cost of living for families across the United States, this tariff war. How does unnecessarily tanking our economy, alienating our allies, and taking money out of the wallets of Americans make us great again? Right now, we should be focused on common sense ways to lower prices and fight inflation. We should be taking genuine steps to slow the flow of fentanyl across our borders, which Canada has made it clear they want to cooperate with us in achieving. We should be working with and not fighting against our closest allies like Canada, and these tariffs do none of that. That is why I'm supporting Senator Tim Kaine's resolution to block the president's abuse of emergency powers. I know Senate Democrats will stand up for American consumers. Can a few Republican colleagues join us? Or will they continue to let Donald Trump and Elon Musk enrich billionaires at the expense of hardworking American families? Mr. President, I ask that the following statement I'm making be placed in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, one of the most important appointments of a President of the United States is a U.S. Attorney. All across the United States, some 90 U.S. attorneys represent the Department of Justice. They do critical work that is essential for the safety and security of America. And the announcement by this administration of Edward Robert Martin, Jr. to serve as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia raises so many questions that I've come to the floor today. Prior to his appointment as an interim U.S. Attorney, Mr. Edward Robert Martin, Jr. made stunning attacks on federal prosecutors and associated himself with individuals who present a threat to our nation. Mr. Martin was a leader of the so-called, quote, Stop the Steal movement, which illegally and from a ridiculous point of view pushed that the 2020 election was not determinative of who was elected president. Mr. Martin himself was on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th and has repeatedly downplayed the violence perpetrated against law enforcement that day. That happens to be a crime scene which I'm familiar with as a member of the Senate, because we were exposed to the crowd storming into the Capitol, storming into the floor of the Senate chamber. Mr. Martin posted the following on social media, quote, like Mardi Gras in D.C. today, love, faith, and joy, ignore fake news, close quote. That's Mr. Martin's description of what was happening in this Capitol building as 140 law enforcement officers were being attacked. Mr. Martin once labeled federal prosecutors in D.C. Mr. Martin once labeled federal prosecutors in D.C. employees of the very office he now seeks to lead as terrorists, quote unquote, for pursuing stiff sentence against violent January 6 rioters. Mr. Martin said, and get this, quote, oath keepers are all of us, in response to a Justice Department prosecution of the leader of this domestic violent extremist organization for seditious conspiracy. Mr. Martin called prosecutors' treatment of insurrectionist Christopher Worrell outrageous. This is a man seeking full-time position as U.S. Attorney, saying that the prosecution of Christopher Worrell was outrageous. He falsely claimed Mr. Worrell was only in the fray a bit, not much, but a bit. In fact, Mr. Worrell, a member of Proud Boys, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for assaulting a group of police officers here in the Capitol with deadly and dangerous weapons. The very day that Mr. Martin called Mr. Worrell's treatment by prosecutors outrageous, Mr. Worrell was a fugitive from the law. He had cut off his GPS ankle monitor 4 days before his scheduled sentencing on August 14, 2023, and was not apprehended until 6 weeks later. Mr. Martin also has extensive ties to this man. His name is Timothy Hale Cuccinelli. He was a January 6 rioter who prosecutors describe as a subscriber of, quote, white supremacist, Nazi sympathizer ideologies that drive his enthusiasm for another civil war, end of quote. At Mr. Hale Cuccinelli's sentencing hearing, Judge Trevor McFadden who was appointed by President Trump, said, quote, of Mr. Hale Cuccinelli before him, statements and actions like yours make Jewish people less safe and less confident they can participate as equal members of our society. Beyond inaccurately portraying Mr. Hale Cuccinelli as a victim of an unjust conviction, Mr. Martin has inexplicably praised Mr. Hale Cuccinelli's character and intellect, despite Mr. Hale Cuccinelli's extensive, well-known personal history of anti-Semitism, misogyny, and racism. According to one of his co-workers, Mr. Hale Cuccinelli once said, and I quote, "Hitler should have finished the job," close quote. Further, Mr. Hale Cuccinelli reportedly claimed that he would kill all Jews and eat them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and he wouldn't need to season them because the salt from their tears would make it flavorful enough. Can you imagine this statement being made by a man who is a close friend of the President's suggestion for U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia? One co-worker recalled Mr. Hale Cuccinelli saying that, quote, babies born with deformities or disabilities should be shot in the forehead, close quote. Another told authorities that Mr. Hale Cuccinelli referred to black people. I can't use the words. I can't repeat them on the floor of the Senate, but it is terrible. According to videos Mr. Hale Cuccinelli himself recorded while storming the Capitol on January 6, he berated an officer guarding the west front of the Capitol, stating, "F you, the revolution will be televised," close quote. Days after the riot, a confidential human source recorded Mr. Hale Cuccinelli saying he wished for there to be another civil war, so he could also say he would give, quote, Jewish people 24 hours to leave the country, close quote. Sickening, outrageous. But stay tuned to what I'm about to report. In September 2024, Mr. Martin, Mr. Martin, the nominee for U.S. Attorney, presented this man, Mr. Hale Cuccinelli, with an award at the Trump Bedminster Club in New Jersey. Mr. Martin called Mr. Hale Cuccinelli, quote, an extraordinary man. An extraordinary man he is, an extraordinary leader. After Mr. Hale Cuccinelli concluded his remarks, he hugged Mr. Martin, who then returned to the podium to say, quote, it's one of the goals of many is to make sure the world, and especially America, hears more from Tim because he's so extraordinary. This shocking conduct necessitates sworn testimony from Mr. Martin. He needs to be brought before the Senate Judiciary Committee and answer for his relationship with this individual. How could anyone be taken seriously as a U.S. attorney with this in his background? He deserves his day under oath to explain it. That's why the Democratic members of the Senate Judiciary Committee have asked Senator Grassley to hold a special hearing for Mr. Martin to explain this and many other things that he has done. The list is long, but the list is also very troubling. Mr. Martin has regularly threatened to prosecute various government employees, members of Congress, and press outlets in an apparent attempt to chill their lawful speech. On February 3rd, 2025, Mr. Martin informed Elon Musk that we will pursue any and all legal action against anybody who impedes your work. 4 days later, he followed up with Mr. Musk and stated, if people are discovered to have broken the law or even acted simply unethically, we will investigate them and we will chase them to the end of the earth to hold them accountable. On February 24th, Mr. Martin specifically targeted the Associated Press, writing, quote, as President Trump's lawyers, we are proud to fight to protect his leadership as our president, and we are vigilant in standing against entities like the Associated Press that refuse to put America first. Finally, since his nomination to serve as U.S. Attorney for District of Columbia, Mr. Martin appears to have attempted to scrub much of his public commentary. For example, nearly 1,000 hours of his podcast have been removed from online platforms, such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts, interfering with the committee's ability to thoroughly examine his record. He's trying to cleanse his past so he doesn't have to explain it. But the fact is, his relationship with this man, presenting him an award at the president's personal club in New Jersey, and then heaping praise on him afterwards, is a clear indication to me that he should never be seriously considered for this job of U.S. Attorney. But let him come before us. Under oath, let him explain it. Let him try to tell us why this man is such an extraordinary leader an extraordinary person, and why this brand of anti-Semitism which he peddles should be tolerated by anyone, let alone the President of the United States. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Good afternoon. I rise today in the Senate chamber for the very first time as a United States Senator to address a topic, unfortunately, that has become important to so many states, so many communities, so many families across this great nation. Before I became a United States Senator and one of your colleagues, I was the Florida Attorney General. For the past 6 years in that position, I made it my mission every day to fight against the opioid crisis and put poison peddlers that sought to do harm to our families behind bars. As many of you know, fentanyl now kills more Americans than any other drug by far, and it is the leading cause of death for working age and fighting age men and women. It is also the cause of death of infants and children that are exposed to this substance, and that number is increasing exponentially. Florida is no stranger to the opioid epidemic. We suffered from a pill mill crisis, and we had to address that by tightening our laws and making sure people had access to help. Following that, we saw a surge of fentanyl pouring into our country and people overdosing from that drug. Fentanyl now claims 70,000 lives a year. It is the deadliest drug our nation has ever encountered. And that is why it is vital that we continue to not lose focus that this is the deadliest thing facing our men and women right now. This is our challenge. We cannot be distracted, and we have to stop this drug from coming across our borders and into our communities. And that is why we have to continue to provide law enforcement the tools that they need to get this drug off our streets and make sure we're providing life-saving medications like naloxone to first responders, and that people that are struggling with addiction know where to get help. After 4 years of a wide-open border and free rein given to drug cartels to smuggle illicit substances into our country, it is no surprise that our nation was flooded with fentanyl. In Florida, we fought back. Despite this surge, our law enforcement officers were up for the task. Our leaders gave us additional resources. Florida led the nation in fentanyl seizures. I, back in 2003, called for the cartels to be labeled foreign terrorist organizations. President Biden ignored our calls. I called for the border to be closed, and then head of DHS to be fired for allowing drug smugglers and countless amounts of fentanyl to flood our country. Those calls were also ignored. So Florida took Biden to court. First, when he stopped deporting those here illegally, committing serious felonies against our citizens, We took him to court. And then when he started welcoming in and paroling everyone into the nation that was barely vetted, we took him to court and we won. We also sent Florida law enforcement to the border to slow down the flow of drugs. We ramped up interdiction efforts with Florida Highway Patrol and Florida Department of Law Enforcement. We fought back with everything that we had. The death and destruction caused by illicit fentanyl started to decline. We started to see hope. Before I left the Attorney General's office, Florida reported 2 straight years of reductions in the number of drug-related deaths. According to a recent FDLA Drugs Identified in Deceased Persons by Medical District Examiner's annual report, fentanyl deaths in our state of Florida dropped 10%. This rate of decline is well ahead of the national average, which declined by about 2% during the same time. Still, thousands across our nation are dying, tens of thousands, and we cannot take our eye off the ball. While we've had success in Florida, we must push forward across the rest of the nation to deliver accountability and protection to the American people. Florida has always been a leader in law and order, and we've understood the danger presented by fentanyl. We understand that many Americans take this deadly drug not even knowing that it is in something else they are ingesting, within counterfeit pills. We classified as fentanyl as a Schedule I controlled substance back in 2017. This allows easier prosecutions for these types of cases. It is time that the federal government follow the requests and the pleas of national law enforcement organizations, including the DEA, that is calling for fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances to be scheduled permanently as Schedule I controlled substance. When I got to Washington, one of my first actions was to join the Halt Fentanyl Act as a co-sponsor. As Attorney General, I led other states in calling on Congress to pass this bill. And now, as Florida's newest United States Senator, I will work tirelessly to make sure this gets done. I'm so proud of my Senate colleagues. Last month, we passed the Halt Fentanyl Act through the Senate, and now it is in the hands of the U.S. House. This bill will ensure federal agents and prosecutors have the tools they need to send a strong message to drug traffickers. If they continue to bring poison into our country, they will be held accountable. That has always been the case in Florida, and I am so proud of my friend and predecessor, former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, who is taking this fight directly to the cartels. The American people gave our great president, President Trump, a mandate last November. That was to restore law and order, make sure people were held accountable for their crimes. We believe, as a Floridian, the first Floridian president in our nation's history, that he is going to take that approach that we've had in Florida to the rest of the nation. While my calls for a closed border and a declaration of drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations fell on Biden's deaf ears, it is no surprise that President Trump immediately got to work on this. On day one, he closed the border. We've seen a 93% drop in illegal crossings since then. Turns out we didn't need a new law. We needed a new president. As one of his first acts, he declared the cartels foreign terrorist organizations. I am incredibly excited to work alongside my new U.S. Senate colleagues and President Trump as we begin to make America safe again. And this includes voting based on priorities that will make our communities and families safe. We have a great opportunity in Washington right now to fight this crisis instead of fueling it through unlawful immigration policies. Now we need to do our part. We need to urge the U.S. House to pass the Halt Fentanyl Act and get it to the President's desk as soon as possible. Mr. President, thank you, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to join my colleagues in talking about the fentanyl crisis that Joe Biden created in our country. Joe Biden had 4 years of open border policies. Millions of people crossed illegally into our country. But on top of that, we saw a surge of fentanyl coming into our country. Fentanyl that is killing our young people. My colleague from Florida just referenced 70,000 people dying from fentanyl. Fentanyl is the leading cause of death among our young people age 18 to 45. That fentanyl starts in communist China, where the precursors are made. And they get shipped to Mexico. The cartels turn it into that final product and bring it across the border. And we saw the impact in Nebraska. In 2019, law enforcement in Nebraska took 46 pills, just 46 pills, laced with fentanyl off of our streets. But after Joe Biden got elected, in just the first 6 months of 2021, that number jumped to 151,000 pills. And it wasn't just the numbers. It was the human cost. Taryn Lee Griffith, a young mom, 2 children. She took a pill that she thought was Percocet, but it was laced with fentanyl, and she died that night. Now her children are going to have to learn about their mom from stories and from pictures because they don't have their mom anymore. Sadly, that story is being told all across this country because of the fentanyl crisis that we have. President Trump was elected to stop this crisis. I mean, think about it. If we had 70,000 Americans killed in a terrorist attack, we'd be up in arms. It's more than are dying from car accidents or from heart disease in that age category. And yet Joe Biden did nothing. And President Trump got elected to stop it, to make a difference, to end this catastrophe. One of the ways he's doing that is by putting tariffs on the countries that are allowing this to ship through their countries, across their borders. I already mentioned how communist China and Mexico are linked to this. There was a daily podcast from the New York Times that talked about how President Trump's policies were already having an impact in Mexico. Some people have said, wait, using tariffs, that's creating a trade war. That is absolutely not the case. The case is this is a drug war. And the president is using the tool of tariffs to get a handle on it, to shut off the flow of fentanyl. In just 1 month under Joe Biden, law enforcement intercepted 1,400 pounds of fentanyl coming into our country. 1 month. That's enough to kill 300 million Americans. President Trump is using his powers to bring that to an end. Now, some people said, well, that's fine. We get it, Mexico, but what about Canada? Canada's not the problem here. But our northern border is also exposed. When Canada released or eased up on some of its visa restrictions, the cartels saw their advantage and started moving operations to Canada to transport both people illegally across the border and fentanyl. In fact, 60 Minutes just did a story where they talked to one of these cartel drug smugglers about what he was doing. And he said that this one smuggler was responsible for moving 30 kilograms of fentanyl across the border from Canada into the United States every month. That's enough to kill 15 million Americans. And he was doing it every month, and that was one smuggler. Now, he also said that lately it had been quiet. They hadn't been moving as much fentanyl. And again, that gets back to President Trump taking a stand to get our neighboring countries to start enforcing their border, to put more resources there, and to start blocking this fentanyl before it gets into our country. These policies are having an impact. They are working. We need Canada and Mexico to continue to do more. President Trump is using his powers to be able to help stop that flow of fentanyl. We are here standing up for secure borders, standing up for American families, standing up for those families who have lost loved ones already to this terrible scourge. We cannot afford to return to an open borders policy. We have to have secure borders. The stakes are too high. Too many lives have already been lost. President Trump is leading the fight to secure our border and stop the flow of this horrible drug into our country. And I am proud to support him in doing that. Mr. President, I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, the fentanyl epidemic has touched nearly every American. Whether it's a family member, a friend, a neighbor, or a coworker, we all know someone whose life has been affected by the tragic reality of this crisis. It's widespread, it's devastating, and it can't be ignored. For too long, this crisis has been fueled by the chaos at our southern border, and now it's happening at our northern border. Today, I rise to honor the American lives lost to our country's horrific fentanyl epidemic, and I call on our Canadian allies to shut down these operations before more devastation occurs. For many Americans, it started with a prescription. For others, it was a single accidental exposure. But for too many, it ended the same way, with a loss of life and eternal grief that comes from losing a loved one. Now, the harsh reality is that fentanyl is a leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. Not cancer, not car accidents, fentanyl. Last year alone, as my colleagues have shared with you, more than 70,000 Americans died from a fentanyl overdose, and unsurprisingly, the Biden administration failed to act. Instead, President Biden willingly chose to let the situation get worse. For years, our southern border has been a major entry point for illegal drugs to pour into our country. But under President Trump's leadership, illegal crossings at the southern border have now dropped 94%. That's real progress. Now, however, we're seeing a dangerous shift. Drug cartels have found a new route and a new loophole to continue trafficking drugs into our communities, and it's through the northern border with Canada. Just last year, Customs and Border Patrol seized enough fentanyl at the northern border to kill 9.5 million Americans. That's nothing short of alarming. In fact, a member of Sinaloa's Cartel, one of Mexico's largest and most well-known operations, they openly bragged, and I quote you this, quote, "Canada's border is much larger than Mexico's. There are more entry points through Canada than through Mexico. A lot more entry points. So that won't stop us," end quote. And when asked about the impact of fentanyl killing countless Americans, here's what he said. And again, I quote, "Unfortunately, here for money, we do anything. It's a business. It's a business," end quote. Friends, killing America is not a business. We should not be endorsing known criminal activity with an action. This is nothing short of a serious threat to our national security. Mr. President, when I talk to sheriffs in all 100 counties in North Carolina, I repeatedly hear the same message. Every single county in North Carolina is a border county. The U.S.-Canada border is the world's longest international border at more than 5,500 miles long, but it remains extraordinarily vulnerable as criminal cartel networks continue to take advantage of the gaps of our porous northern border. I think it's important to know that 87% of all terror watch list suspects that were encountered at land border ports last year, they came across our northern border. We have invested heavily in our southern border, and rightfully so, we've done that. And we should continue to do so at our southern border. But the northern border has been overlooked and under-resourced for way too long. Our law enforcement officers, they're doing everything that they can, but without enough resources, they're being set up to fail. And that's not fair to them. We're just watching history repeat itself, and if we don't act to provide our law enforcement officials with the proper tools and technology that they need to defend our northern border, we're going to allow this to get even worse. And what's even more disturbing is that Mexican cartels are now setting up fentanyl labs in Canada and expanding their role in the global drug trade. Now, as our ally, we need Canada to step up before more lives are lost, because the truth is that behind every statistic is a grieving family. And the American people deserve more than just empty words. They deserve real action. The fentanyl crisis will not only continue to strangle our country until we deal with the threat at our northern border, like the emergency that it truly is. I yield the floor.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to join my colleagues in calling attention to the devastating fentanyl fallout, made significantly worse by 4 years of failed Democrat open border policies, and to note the return of common sense border security policies led by Senate Republicans and President Trump. In March, Border Patrol agents encountered just 7,181 illegal immigrants attempting to cross the border, the southern border. 7,181. This is in stark contrast compared to just 1 year ago, when under President Biden, the total encounters for the month of March totaled 137,473. That represents a 95% decrease in crossings, from over 137,000 to about 7,000. This sharp drop of illegal encounters is thanks to a new administration and a new Republican majority in the House and Senate, which has prioritized securing our border by resuming policies that brought historically low encounters just 4 years ago. And, I mean, policies that we put in place 4 years ago that worked then, we put them back in place. They're working now. So all that discussion on the part of the Biden administration saying, oh, my gosh, they needed some new law somehow, just isn't so, is it? The numbers make that abundantly clear. And, of course, that means reinstating the migrant protection protocols or the Remain in Mexico policy, working with other countries to get them to accept the return of their migrants, and resuming construction of the border wall. Again, common sense policies. Reinstating these policies help curb the illegal entry of individuals at our border and has begun the process of making our country safe again. But the work's not done. While taking advantage of the failed border policies of the prior administration, cartels and other transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, flooded the border and gained a criminal foothold in our country. The presence of the cartels and other bad actors operating within our borders led to criminal acts like drug trafficking, human smuggling, and other illegal activities. On his first day in office, President Trump signed a series of executive orders addressing the border crisis that have been affecting our country, and has begun the process of removing criminals who had illegally entered under the previous administration. These executive actions have served as the first steps in reversing the catch and release policies that allowed members of cartels, gangs, and violent transnational criminal organizations like MS-13 and Tren de Aragua to remain in the United States while operating criminal enterprises. By declaring an emergency at the border, DHS, DOD, and DOJ were able to take a whole-of-government approach and begin working together to identify the criminals that were illegally operating these networks within our country. The result of these harmful Democrat open border policies has been felt by us all and have turned every state into a border state. Leadership for the DEA Omaha Division, which includes my state, said it plainly and simply: the repeated presence of fentanyl in our communities is due to outside forces. Quote, the precursor chemicals are coming from China. They go down to Mexico, and from there, they're pushed up into our communities. End quote. The numbers reflect this. 2023 officials in North Dakota seized 21,000 more fentanyl pills than the year before, 30 pounds more meth, and 2.5 times more pounds of cocaine. Last month, the Republican majorities in both chambers, House and the Senate, voted to continue funding for key programs at DHS and DOJ that combat the rise in illicit drugs like fentanyl. Unfortunately, our colleagues across the aisle voted against that effort. While the United States stands prepared to take on the scourge of fentanyl that is impacting our citizens, other countries must step up as well. As a result of the actions taken by this administration, both Canada and Mexico have begun to be engaged partners on this issue. In February, the President of Mexico agreed to send 10,000 National Guard troops to help secure its northern border with the United States. And the Canadian government has named a fentanyl czar, listed Mexican cartels as terrorist groups, and launched a Canada-U.S. joint strike force to combat organized crime, fentanyl, and money laundering. Additionally, the Canadian government has increased its law enforcement presence at the border with a 56% increase in border personnel at land borders and ports of entry. CBP officers, Border Patrol agents, state, local, and tribal law enforcement are stepping up to take on the fentanyl crisis at our borders. I urge our Democrat colleagues in a bipartisan way to join us and support the effort to continue securing our border and to go after the criminals that have illegally entered our country and continue to do harm. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that Senator Wyden and I both be able to complete our remarks before the vote.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I do appreciate so much my colleagues coming to the floor just to be able to talk about the scourge of fentanyl and what it's really doing in our communities on this. Senator Ricketts, Senator Moody, Senator Budd, Senator Hoeven have spent a lot of time laying out the challenges that we really face. I think most Americans know it and have seen it. They just don't realize how fast it's really moving. 10 years ago, we had 700 deaths in the country due to fentanyl. Last year, we had 87,000. That's the acceleration we've seen in the decade. The vast majority of fentanyl used to come across the border from, quite frankly, China. It was being mailed in, and then active work was done to be able to shut that down. It started coming through Mexico. That is aggressively, we're taking that on, and the cartels and the criminal organizations are shifting more and more to Canada to be able to find ways to be able to move it in. And the Canadians have seen that and have noted that as well by the aggressive actions that they have taken. But just to give you a quick glance at this, dealing with just the fentanyl issue, in 2020, the Canadians interdicted 1,000 pounds of fentanyl precursors. In 2021, it was 11,000 pounds. So that's the acceleration that's also happening for these criminal organizations that are trying to be able to move fentanyl into our country and, quite frankly, into Canada as well. So we're grateful for their partnership, but we definitely see this as an emergency. A decade ago, the United States did not move fast enough to be able to stop the movement of fentanyl into our country, and we've lost tens of thousands of Americans. President Trump is determined, and quite frankly, this Congress is determined, we're not going to be asleep on that again. That we will take it very, very seriously. It is a very big emergency to be able to move. So I thank my colleagues for coming here to be able to talk about it today. Mr. President, I also wanted to be able to spend some time talking about an issue that we have that we also have to address. And it's a totally different subject, but it's dealing with unemployment insurance that was actually done during the pandemic. This may not seem a big issue to some, to say that was a long time ago when we were dealing with the pandemic. Thankfully, it's more and more in our rearview mirror. But during the pandemic, we had billions of dollars of unemployment fraud that occurred during that time period. Billions. Where criminal organizations saw that America was moving fast to be able to stop the unemployment problem that was in our country. Obviously, during the pandemic itself, the United States quickly ramped up to be able to provide benefits, and criminal organizations ramped up just as fast to be able to go after it. During that time period, as far as the Inspector General has seen at this point, the Inspector General has identified $191 billion with a B, $191 billion of unemployment insurance that was inappropriately distributed. $191 billion. And you may say, what's the issue with that and why are we bringing it up now? Well, unemployment fraud is a criminal action. It has a 5-year statute of limitations on that. The first of the unemployment benefits were actually put out 5 years ago this week. That means criminal organizations that moved quickly to actually try to go after unemployment insurance that did not qualify for it, 5 years ago this week, if we have not actually started that prosecution of them, they're going to get away with it. And you know what? Next week, there's another group. Next week, there's another group. Next week, there's another group. And until this body determines that we need to stop unemployment fraud and we should not allow criminal organizations to get away with $191 billion of tax dollars, they're going to continue to get away with more of it every single week. So, Mr. President, what I bring is actually a solution to this. It's a simple extension of the statute of limitations for the unemployment insurance. This is simple. This is straightforward. This is already overwhelmingly passed the House of Representatives. It passed with a vote of 295 to 127. That is 83 House Democrats voting for this bill. This is a very bipartisan bill, and this is just a straight extension of this so that we stop the fraud that we know 100% and our inspector generals have already identified and says has occurred to the tune of $191 billion that we know of. So, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 29, H.R. 1156. I further ask the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
An objection.
In the right to object.
The senator from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I want it understood. I want it understood that we take a backseat to nobody when it comes to fighting this fraud. And that's why I negotiated a bipartisan package in the last Congress dealing with a host of issues relating to addressing fraud and making improvements to unemployment insurance. I negotiated that bill with our ranking member, now the chairman of the Finance Committee, and I'm a little struck by what's going on here because my colleague, my friend from Oklahoma, was a co-sponsor of that proposal. In other words, we did what the American people say they want, which is to have people find common ground on common sense matters like fighting fraud. Our bipartisan proposal went after pandemic-era fraud by extending the statute of limits on prosecutions. It would help to prevent fraud in the future. It would help states improve their unemployment insurance programs to get benefits out on time in the event of a big economic crash like we saw in 2020. It would make better use of data to prevent abuse. It would protect people who got overpayments entirely due to somebody else's mistake and who may not even know it to this day. So I will tell you, I think it is odd at best, but certainly disappointing, that our Republican colleagues have decided to walk away from a really good bipartisan agreement. The proposal they brought to the floor is much smaller, it's much narrower. In fact, instead of looking forward, it's looking backward. No improvements to unemployment insurance, no fraud prevention looking at the future. In fact, the bill before the Senate actually cuts $5 million of crucial fraud prevention funding that Democrats secured after the pandemic. So you ask yourself, why are Republicans attempting to make this cut? Because the nonpartisan experts at the Congressional Budget Office looked at this narrow proposal my colleagues have brought forward. They've said if Congress were to pass this bill, Republicans would spend more money trying to track down fraud than they'd actually recover from the fraudsters. So government efficiency is something we're all interested in. You got me at hello on the concept of working on those kinds of issues in a bipartisan way. But here's a Republican anti-fraud proposal that loses taxpayer dollars overall. And to pay for it, they'd cut future fraud prevention. That just strikes me as defying common sense. Another issue with this approach I want to highlight. The bill now before the Senate fails to provide any protections for workers who got overpaid through no fault of their own. Colleagues may remember that when the Pandemic UI program was created, it was in the midst of the COVID crisis, highest unemployment since the Great Depression, tens of millions of Americans out of work, entire sectors of our economy essentially mothballed. Congress scrambled to create an unemployment insurance program for Americans who weren't eligible for traditional unemployment insurance. Without it, a whole lot of people would have gone hungry and lost their homes. In the rush to get urgently needed relief to those out of work, some states made mistakes, provided a number of workers more in unemployment than they were entitled to. These workers didn't defraud anybody. A lot of those people who received overpayments had no idea that they got more money than they should have. The issue is some states are running their unemployment insurance programs with decrepit old systems they can barely keep up, and they made mistakes. Now, 5 years down the line, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to claw back these payments, even from people who did nothing wrong. In fact, some of these people to this day aren't even aware that they were overpaid. They certainly aren't fraudsters. The states made mistakes in the heat of an economic crisis. The Congress shouldn't be punishing individual workers who had no idea in the first place what was going on. A final issue with the proposal. The Trump administration has made a mockery of fraud prevention by illegally firing the Department of Labor Inspector General. The Inspector General's office successfully oversaw unemployment fraud investigations throughout the pandemic. In my view, Firing the Inspector General is a big setback in the fight against fraud in the unemployment insurance program. The Trump administration has also given DOJ unfettered access to unemployment insurance claims data. The bill before the Senate would allow DOJ to falsely accuse innocent workers of fraud years after unemployment insurance helped them keep food on the table during the pandemic. That is not being tough on fraud. That is making innocent people victims. Democrats are all in on bringing criminals who defrauded the UI system to justice and building a more reliable, durable unemployment insurance system for the future. That is why, colleagues, we negotiated a really strong bipartisan anti-fraud, package. For the life of me, I don't understand walking away from that package now, especially in favor of a narrower proposal that would lose taxpayer dollars and sacrifice the effort to fight fraud. So therefore, I would ask the senator to modify the request so that the Wyden substitute amendment, which is at the desk and is the text of the Wyden-Crapo Unemployment Insurance Integrity and Accountability Act, be considered and agreed to. The bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there an objection to the modification?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from Oklahoma.
My friend from Oregon, and we are friends, and we have the opportunity to be able to serve together and work on a lot of issues, is correct. I'm glad to be able to see a larger proposal to deal with unemployment insurance. It's been an issue for a long time. But this is one of the most classic examples of saying the perfect is the enemy of the good. Today, we have people getting away with fraud. Today. And we can do nothing about it because the statute of limitations has run out. The House has passed a bipartisan bill by a wide majority to deal with this one problem, and they have come to an agreement on a wide bipartisan majority to say, let's at least solve this part, and then we'll work on bigger solutions later. What my friend is recommending is to say, no, let's force everyone to work on the bigger solution, and every single day let more people get away with fraud until we come up with the bigger solution and can agree on it. We should stop as much fraud as we can today and keep working on the bigger solution to be able to get the bigger issues done. If I can also say to my friend, he knows this bill well as well, this is not about incidental actions that have happened to someone who accidentally filled out something or a state did something inappropriately. This bill is very clear. That's why it had such a strong bipartisan support out of the House. This is about criminal actors. These are people that criminally engaged in large-scale fraud deliberately. It's $191 billion out there that the Inspector General under the Biden administration even identified. So I want to do as much as we can on the unemployment insurance side, but let's do things as quickly as we can to be able to stop criminal activity and to be able to prosecute those individuals. So knowing that, I will not modify my request.
Objection to the modification is heard. Is there an objection to the original request?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from Oregon.
So let me make sure we're clear with my friend, because we do a lot of work together and I'm looking forward to continuing it. I don't see much to object to this afternoon. We both want to be all in on the fight against fraud. Those were the first words out of my mouth. Let's go all in fighting this horrendous fraud. And that's why we worked so long in a bipartisan way, because you're not the only Republican from the committee who worked with me, and it's a large bill. It deals with a big problem. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why we aren't dealing with a big problem and not creating innocent victims, more of them. So at this point, I guess there's gridlock today, but I want to extend the olive branch again, which I've been doing from day one. I want a big bill that goes after big-time fraud in a very aggressive way. And I'm still baffled by why we're not out here with a whole lot of Republicans who are co-sponsors of my bill with the senator from Idaho as the chair and saying this is the way we ought to be governing. But I object, and Mr. President, I hope we're back.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Working on a larger proposal in the days ahead. That larger proposal is not going to move in the House in the next month, or 2 months. And in the meantime, we're going to have criminal organizations getting away with it over and over and over again. So let's move as much as we can, as fast as we can. But at least at this point, let's solve what we can today.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
just very briefly, my colleague says nothing's going to happen in the House to fight fraud. I got to tell you, I don't see any fraud caucus out there in either the Senate or the House. There are no rallies for people who are committing outrageous fraud. I think we ought to move. We ought to move here. We've done the hard work. We've done the heavy lifting. And my colleague from Oklahoma knows what it's like when he's trying to put together a bipartisan bill. We've done that work. I think we ought to move here and then talk to our colleagues in the House. Why don't you now pick up on the hard work we've done, and we'll get serious about fraud. So we're going to continue this conversation, and I've always wanted to work with my colleague from Oklahoma on these kinds of issues, and we're going to stay at it until we deal with big-time fraud in a big-time way in the United States Senate in a bipartisan way. Mr. President, I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to waive the mandatory quorum calls with respect to the Sawyer and Dillon nominations.
Is there an objection? Without objection. Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Dean Sawyer of Missouri to be Solicitor General of the United States, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Dean Sawyer of Missouri to be the Solicitor General of the United States shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks.
Yes. I need to update it to the old man log.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal.
My staff showed me the video. Sometimes I can't.
Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth.
Tony, you got my vote, right?
Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Yeah. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Height-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz,
just ask me anything you want to, or tell me anything you want to.
Mr. Schiff,
If I did something stupid today, you can tell me.
Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hoeven, Husted, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Moody, Moreno, Murkowski, Paul, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Tillis, Tuberville, and Young. Yes. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Durbin, Hassan, Markey, Merkley, Rosen, Schatz, Warren, and Wyden. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. King, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye.
I don't actually understand your number counting.
Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Ms. Lotkin, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Booker, no.
On this vote, the ayes are 53, the nays are 46. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Harmeet Dillon of California to be an Assistant Attorney General, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandate and quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Harmeet Dillon of California to be an Assistant Attorney General shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks.
Yes.
Mr. Barrasso.
Round time.
Mr. Bennett. Mr. Graham. Thanks. I did. Mrs. Blackburn. Thanks. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines. Thank you. Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego. Young. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan. Thank you. Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy. Thank you. Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Budd, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Curtis, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted,
Hyde-Smith, Justice, Langford, Lummis, McConnell, Moody, Moran, Paul, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Wicker, and Young. Mr. McCormick, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Lujan, Ossoff, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, and Welch. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Mullen, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Alsobrooks, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Marino, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye.
Keep it, take good care of it.
Mr. Whitehouse, no. Ms. Smith, no.
Mr. Daines, aye.
The yeas are 52, the nays are 45. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Justice, Harmeet Dillon of California to be an Assistant Attorney General.
President,
The senator from Kentucky.
I ask unanimous consent to proceed to legislative session.
Without objection.
I ask that the Senate execute the order of March 26th with respect to S.J. Res. 37.
Under the previous order, the Committee on Finance is discharged from further consideration of S.J. Res. 37, which the clerk will report.
S.J. Res. 37, joint resolution terminating the national emergency declared to impose duties on articles imported from Canada.
Under the previous order, there are now 6 hours of debate equally divided on the joint resolution.
Mr. President,
The senator from Kentucky.
taxation without representation is tyranny, bellowed James Otis. In the days and weeks and years leading up to the American Revolution, this became the rallying cry of American patriots. No taxation without representation. The American patriots thought that a distant parliament in England, where they had no representation, had no right to tax them. This was the rallying cry, no taxation without representation. Our founding fathers believed so strongly in this, they embodied it in our Constitution. Our Constitution doesn't allow any one man or woman to raise taxes. It must be the body of Congress. Now, this wasn't new. This was part of maybe a 1,000-year tradition from Magna Carta on. In Magna Carta, it is stated, no taxation without the common council of the realm. Even at that time, they were chafing at one man, the king, determining the taxes for the land. 100 years before our Revolutionary War, in the English Civil War, there was a debate over parliamentary supremacy versus supremacy of the king. They did not want to pay taxes that weren't approved by the Parliament. In 1683, the New York Charter on Liberties, the beginning charter for the colony of New York, stated, no taxation without representation. After this English Civil War, the English Bill of Rights embodied no taxation without the consent of Parliament. This principle was long-standing, It was non-negotiable. This was what sparked the revolution. And yet today we are here before the Senate because one person in our country wishes to raise taxes. Well, this is contrary to everything our country was founded upon. One person is not allowed to raise taxes. The Constitution forbids it. The Constitution was so concerned with the power of taxes, which some have said the power of taxes is the power to destroy. But our founding fathers were so concerned with this that they said, no, the president will not have the power to legislate. The president will not have the power to tax. Only Congress will be able to tax the people, and only by originating tax bills in the House. It was that specific. They were so mortified. They were so worried by having a monarchy. They were so worried about having all the power gravitate to the executive that they said we must split the powers. They based a lot of their thinkings on Montesquieu. Montesquieu wrote in the 1740s, 40, 50 years before our Constitution, Montesquieu wrote that when the legislative and executive powers are united in one, there can be no liberty. This is something that our founding fathers took to heart. They said, we must separate the powers. We must at all costs limit the power of the presidency. This isn't about political party. I voted for and supported President Trump, but I don't support the rule of one person. We are set, the president is set to have a 25% tax on goods coming from Canada and Mexico. This is a tax, plain and simple, on the American people. But one person can't do that. Our founding fathers said, no, that would be illegal for one person to raise taxes. It has to come to Congress. It has to originate in the House. This has gone on for 200 and some odd years. You can't simply declare an emergency and say, well, the constitutional republic was great, but gosh, we've got an emergency. Our times are dire. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said there are no exemptions for emergency. There was no exemption for a pandemic. There is no exemption for emergencies. The taxation clause stands. It's an important part of the Constitution. Taxes must originate in the House. They must be voted on in Congress. No one man can raise taxes on the people. They are set to do this through a process in which an emergency has been declared. But realize this, one person declares an emergency, the president, and even if we are successful, which I think we will be successful here today, a majority will vote to say this is wrong-headed and the emergency should end. We'd have to go to the House. But even if we were successful in the House, the president would veto it. It would take a 2/3 vote in order to stop an emergency. That's such a burden that we need to consider reforming the emergency powers and reversing this. I think a president can have times that there are emergencies, and the president can declare emergency, but it should last 30 days at most. At the end of 30 days, the emergency would be brought to the people's house, the House of Representatives and the senators, and we would vote whether to affirm or uphold an emergency. Right now, the pretense of this emergency is fentanyl. I don't discount fentanyl. I know families who have lost kids to fentanyl. But there's more fentanyl going from the United States into Canada than there is coming from Canada into the United States. There is no emergency. The Canadians have actually been cooperative with us and said they will try to do even more. But the problem isn't in Canada. Even if the problem is valid, even if that is something that we all agree on, you can't have a country ruled by emergency. You can't have a country without a separation of powers, without checks and balances. Madison put it this way. Madison said that we would pit ambition against ambition, that all men, and frankly all women, are motivated by self-interest and the self-accumulation or aggrandizement of power, and so we would limit their power by pitting ambition against ambition. We would give some of the power to the House, some of the power to the Senate, some to the president. There would be checks and balances and a jostling for power, but we would check and balance each other. Part of the problem we face today with this emergency, though, is that Congress has abdicated their power. Not just recently, not just for this president. This is a bipartisan problem. I am a Republican. I am a supporter of Donald Trump. But this is a bipartisan problem. I don't care if the president is a Republican or a Democrat. I don't want to live under emergency rule. I don't want to live where my representatives cannot speak for me and have a check and balance on power. One person can make a mistake. And guess what? Tariffs are a terrible mistake. They don't work. They will lead to higher prices. They are a tax, and they have historically been bad for our economy. But even if this were something that was magic and was going to be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I wouldn't want to live under emergency rule. I would want to live in a constitutional republic where there are checks and balances against the excesses of both sides, right or left. If one person rules, that person could make a horrible mistake. On things so important as war, it's the same thing. We don't want a president just to go to war because a president might get angry with some country or have a vendetta. We're supposed to vote. That's why declaration of war. War originates also in Congress. But we've lost so many of these things, and so much of this, it's Congress's fault for giving it. Over the last 70 years, there's probably a dozen pieces of legislation where Congress said to the president, here, take this power. Create emergencies, put on tariffs, negotiate for us because we're too feeble-minded to do it ourselves. But the thing is, the Constitution doesn't let us give our power away. There's something called the non-delegation clause, and it says that we're not allowed to give power away. We can't just say, here, Mr. President, take it. In this particular case, it's even worse. The rule of law, the IEPA is the acronym for it, has never been used for tariffs before and doesn't mention the word tariff. So this isn't something that was targeted in times of need. The president can have the power to put on tariffs. Never says that. This will be an extraordinary use of something never intended to be a way to have unilateral, one single person invoke a tax on the people. With regard to tariffs, let's be very clear. Tariffs are simply taxes. Tariffs don't punish foreign governments, they punish American families. When we tax imports, we raise the price of everything, from groceries to smartphones to washing machines to prescription drugs. Every dollar collected in tariff revenue comes straight out of the pockets of American consumers. Conservatives used to understand that tariffs are taxes on the American people. Conservatives used to be uniformly opposed to raising taxes because we wanted the private marketplace, the private individuals to keep more of their income, so we were always for lower taxes. And yet now the mantra that's coming is we want higher taxes. What happened? Did we all of a sudden give up all the things we used to believe in as conservatives? I, for one, haven't. I still think more taxes is bad for the economy. More money taking out of the productive sector, the private sector, and giving to the government is a mistake. To those who still call themselves conservatives, but now support tariffs, let me remind them that Milton Friedman said, tariffs raise prices to consumers and waste our resources. To those who still have a fond memory of Ronald Reagan on my side, Ronald Reagan said, protectionism costs consumers billions of dollars, damages the overall economy, and destroys jobs. Ronald Reagan's vision for America can be seen in our trading relationships with Canada. In 1986, President Reagan said, our trade policy rests firmly on the foundation of free and open markets. I recognize the inescapable conclusion that all history has taught. The freer the flow of world trade, the stronger the tides of human progress and peace among nations. And it's absolutely true. If you look at a chart or a graph of world trade over the last 70 years, it's gone like this. We've been trading more with each other. If you look at a world map of prosperity, it's the same curve. It's a hockey stick. It's going up exponentially. If you look at a curve of poverty, 100,000 people are escaping poverty every day around the world, and it's because of international trade. Trade is good, not bad. Think about it. If you buy something, you are trading.
If you go to the store and you buy a smartphone and you give them $1,000, you want that smartphone and you don't lose. Doesn't matter where the money went, you got your smartphone. You only give money to somebody for something if you want it. If it's a voluntary trade, it's always equal. Or it's actually always mutually beneficial. And so when people say, oh, we've lost and China's winning and we have a trade deficit with China, America doesn't trade with China. An individual buys a product. You are the trader. When you go to Walmart and you buy something at Walmart and you say, my goodness, I can get this TV for $200 less than I could get it if there were only domestic TVs, you are the contractor. The U.S. government didn't buy the TV. You bought the TV and you did it because you saved $200. You're now $200 richer and you can go somewhere. You can buy gas to go on a trip somewhere. You are richer. But if trade were bad, you wouldn't buy the TV. You made the decision. The government didn't. Our government doesn't trade with their government. Our individuals buy products from their individuals. If it's a voluntary trade, everyone benefits or the trade doesn't occur. It is perhaps no surprise then that the United States and Canada share the world's longest international land border and are continuously at peace. Canada is a great customer of ours. In fact, Canada buys more American goods than China, Japan, England, and France combined. So do we want the Canadians to buy less of our stuff or more of our stuff? It is a crazy notion to put a 25% tariff on this enormous amount of goods. There are predictions that cars are going to cost $10,000 more because the cars go in and out. We have cars made in Kentucky, but some of the parts go to Mexico. Some of the cars go to Mexico. Some of them go to Canada. They come back. $10,000 increase. Do you love the idea of tariffs? Is it such a great word to pay $10,000 more for a car? Canada is also the leading provider of grain, livestock, meat, and poultry. The U.S. imported $97 billion worth of oil and gas from Canada last year. Canada is a major provider of cars, car parts, steel, lumber, aluminum. This amount of trading demonstrates that no American will be able to avoid the high taxes, the high prices they'll be forced to pay because of tariffs. The taxes on Canadian imports will come at a great cost to American families. The taxes on Canadian imports will make the cost of food, fuel, cars, and furniture more expensive. The former conservatives that now sing a populist tune know deep down that their advocacy of higher taxes will cause suffering for the American family. The converts to this protectionist faith cannot help but acknowledge that even they know that the tariffs will raise prices. They admit it readily. The tariffs that they put on in 2019 are still punishing the farmers in our country to such an extent that the farmers are still asking for more subsidies. When the Trump tariffs went on in 2018, 2019, the farmers immediately complained that they were given $23 billion of taxpayer money. That's an acknowledgement that the tariffs hurt farmers. So we're going to do it again, and they're all lining up, and people say we're going to have to bail them out. Are we going to have to bail out the car companies too? Are we going to have to bail out everybody that's going to be hurt by these tariffs? It's not a good idea. The administration is currently considering a bailout for farmers. The idea that the American taxpayer will have to bail out an industry to dull the pain of tariffs is not a novel one. We've seen this one. We've seen this story. What our parents told us when we were kids is still true today. Actions speak louder than words. The supporters of tariffs know that their policies impose suffering, and they are willing to spend your money to alleviate that harm. So they know tariffs are going to hurt farm exports, so they're going to take your money and give it to the farmers. What kind of policy acknowledges, hey, I got a terrible policy, it's going to hurt these people, but we'll just give them some of your money? It makes no sense at all. In addition to the previous costs, the Peterson Institute estimates that tariffs will cost the average family $1,200 a year. The Budget Lab at Yale University estimates that tariffs will cost the average family $4,200 a year. In fact, according to the analysis, tariffs could cost the least fortunate families on average $2,400. The middle class will likely pay higher costs of about $3,000. Tariffs are a cost. Taxes are a cost. If you tax a good, it's added onto the cost. This is what happens. It happens whether inflation is the tax or whether the tax is a tariff. It adds to the cost of goods and it will be passed on to the consumer. The average American family won't get the bailouts, though. If you're a special interest and the taxes hurt you, the tariffs hurt you, you'll get a bailout. But if you're just an average person working for yourself, self-employed, and the tariffs cost all of your groceries to go up, they cause your electronics to go up, no one's going to help you. You'll just pay higher prices. If you think the cost of eggs is high, just wait until the tariff hits cars. According to Goldman Sachs, the tariffs will raise the price of a car between $5,000 and $15,000. And despite arguments to the contrary, Americans know that tariffs are a tax they will have to pay. That is why vehicle sales jumped almost 13% last month, because people are trying to buy their cars before the tariff gets on their car and raises the price. People are smarter than politicians. That's nothing new. It's not just cars that will be more expensive as a result of tariffs. Energy will be more expensive. Gas prices in some parts of the country could see a 15 to 30 cent per gallon price. According to the National Association of Home Builders, the building of a single-family home could be coming up $10,000 more expensive. Why? Because we import lumber. We import steel. If we make it more expensive to import lumber from Canada and steel from Canada, the price of your house goes up. Look, people already can't buy a house because interest rates are so high. Young people are living in apartments more and more. People feel stuck in their life, and we're going to add to the price of lumber and steel to make homes even harder to purchase. It's a terrible idea. Washing machines were already almost $100 more expensive as a result of the original tariffs 4 years ago. And here's really bad news. Even beer could become more expensive. A professor at Northeastern University states that a six-pack of Corona could go up by 45 cents, but a small craft beer could be increased by as much as $1 a pint. The former and never were conservatives who try to sell tariffs as anything other than a tax cannot fool the American people, who know that their purchasing power will be weakened with every new protectionist measure unilaterally imposed by the White House. And none of these tax hikes are necessary. The populists argue that the threat of tariffs are needed to force Canada to stop the flow of illicit drugs. In fact, one of the social media posts today said there was going to be a tariff on fentanyl. Really? You think the drug dealer is going to pay a tariff on fentanyl? Fentanyl's not being tariffed. That's just sort of some kind of mistaken notion. But this isn't going to happen. And as I've stated, there's more fentanyl going from the U.S. into Canada than there is coming from Canada in the U.S. It's not a real emergency. It's being used to place a tax on the American people. But already we've seen a response from Canada. In response to a threat of tariffs, Canada announced a $1.3 billion plan dedicated to border security, to up border security on fentanyl, and yet the tariffs are still coming despite their help, but they've also announced more tariffs as well. The threat of tariffs seems to have worked. We need to not make Canada and America go through this when they've already responded to our requests. The chaos of one day the tariffs are on, one day they're off, next day there's a loophole for this industry or that industry is chaotic.
Hey, one second.
थोड़ा गर्म पानी पीता हूँ जो हमने माँ हमारी जो दूध पिलाई उसके ऊपर चल रहा है
क्योंकि आपका गला काफी मजबूत है. Honorable members, pleased to extend birthday greetings to Honorable Member of Parliament, Shri Samirul Islam. One of the youngest members of the House, full of energy. He is in Rajya Sabha since 2023 August, representing the state of West Bengal. A son of a farmer, a postgraduate from IIT Delhi, and chemistry professor at Deenbandhu Andrews College, Kolkata, Sri Samirul Islam has truly risen from the grassroots. An educationist by passion and profession, he is deeply committed to social work and currently serves as the chairman of the West Bengal Migrant Workers Welfare Board. Sri Samirul Islam is also the president of the Bangla Sanskriti Manch, an organization for the welfare of backward and vulnerable sections of the society. Sri Samirul Islam is married to Shrimati Sabnam Sultana, a practicing lawyer. The couple is blessed with daughters Inayat and Janat. Honorable members, on my own and on behalf of the House, I wish him and his family a long, healthy and happy life, and extend greetings to his family members and friends. Honorable members, I extend my most profound salutations on this auspicious occasion of Rajya Sabha Day. The Council of States, our esteemed Rajya Sabha, stands dignified as the House of Elders, the distinguished upper chamber of our parliamentary democracy. As the quintessential edifice of India's federal architecture, this venerable institution ensures comprehensive representation, equilibrium in governance, and the cultivation of contemplative sagacity. Rajya Sabha endures as a distinguished forum where provincial perspectives and specialized expertise converge to enrich our national trajectory. As the Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi astutely remarked during the 250th session, while the Rajya Sabha may be designated as the second house, it remains unequivocally paramount in its significance. The Parliament stands as our Polaris, our unwavering North Star, illuminating the path. माननीय खड़गे जी, आप गले के लिए क्या लेते हैं? हैं? वन सेकेंड
थोड़ा गर्म पानी पीता हूँ। जो हमने माँ हमारी जो दूध पिलाई उसके ऊपर चल रहा है।
क्योंकि आपका गला काफी मजबूत है। Honorable members, pleased to extend birthday greetings to Honorable Member of Parliament, Sri Samirul Islam. One of the youngest members of the House, full of energy. He is in Rajya Sabha since 2023 August, representing the state of West Bengal. a son of a farmer, a postgraduate from IIT Delhi, and chemistry professor at Deenbandhu Andrews College, Kolkata, Sri Samirul Islam has truly risen from the grassroots. An educationist by passion and profession, he is deeply committed to social work and currently serves as the chairman of the West Bengal Migrant Workers Welfare Board. Sri Samirul Islam is also the president of the Bangla Sanskriti Manch